Um, Today we've got Coach Victor Hoffmann, one of our strength coaches. Kind of like last time when we had Coach Midlow just talk with y'all about some of the things we talked about in class, but what they're actually doing in the field. So you can know that I'm not just BSing it. It is actually something people do in the field. I know I said I was a strength coach, but it's been a while, so it's always good to get what actual coaches are doing. Let me just make sure this mic's up high enough. Test is on Thursday over the Unit 2 information, so a lot of just program design and everything like that. For y'all's projects, if you do want me to hop on there and take a look, just let me know. I know a few people have, so I have access to view everything you've done. So just let me know if you want me to hop on there and take a look, give you some pointers or tips. But yeah, Thursday, same thing as the first exam. It'll be 50 questions like the CSCS. You have 3 answer choices per. Just know with this, especially in the applied side, this and the next exam, there are some questions that are phrased like choose which of these is the best answer for it. I do that because if you take the CSCS, you're going to have those questions and be able to delineate that. So you could make an argument for, well, any of these would be correct, but there is one, if you really looked through the book and paid attention when we're talking about that, this is going to be the clear winner, which is going to be the best for strength or hypertrophy or pick your poison on that. Any questions on that exam though, before I turn it over? All right, I'll turn it over to you, Coach, and
I got my, just click on through this way.
yeah.
Perfect.
Good.
Maybe testing it out. This is why we test it.
Yeah.
Or I can just click with the mouse.
There, okay, you should be able to now.
Aha.
Yeah, awesome.
Perfect. So like you said, my name is Victor Hoffmann. I've been at State since March of 2023, so just over 2 years now. And I currently work with men's golf, women's golf, and women's soccer. So today we're just going to talk about program design as we kind of move through. I'm fortunate I have one fall sport that's in season, one spring sport that's in season. So I'm always kind of flipping between that off season and in season mode, and with 2 very different sports from a load demand, just overall in terms of just everything that goes into the sport, very, very different on the golf and the soccer side. So it kind of keeps me on my toes at all times as a coach, but it's kind of helped me on the program design side as well. So just kind of starting off my coaching timeline. So starting off on the far left, May of 2018 is when I graduated from the University of Louisville. I grew up in Louisville, born and raised, was there all the way until right after graduation. And then I had the brilliant idea to go volunteer intern at the University of Florida from 2018 to 2019. When I was there, that was my first real big strength and conditioning experience. So I was working with pretty much every Olympic sport they had: track and field, swim and dive, volleyball, pretty much anything you can think of. So I had a chance to work with some really high-level coaches, high-level athletes when I was still there. For you all that know him, Ryan Lofty was still there doing some extra training on the swim side. Caleb Dressel was there. Just some really big-time track and field swim and dive athletes that I got to work around on a daily basis, kind of help shape my philosophy as well. From there, I took a graduate assistantship at University of Memphis. I was there from July 19 to February 2023, so literally right up to before this position started. And I had 3 different positions while I was there. So when I started, I was a GA. I kind of had some of the smaller sports. I had cheerleading that I was working at night. I had, cross country, things like that. And then after one of our strength coaches left, I graduated, got my master's there. Still wanted me around, so I worked up to a fellow role for 6 months, and then I became a full-time assistant strength and conditioning coach where I had about 5 sports, all the way up until I got here in March of 2023. And like I said before, I've been with women's soccer, men's golf, and women's golf ever since. I do help a little bit with other sports, but those are my primary focuses throughout the year. So this is the position that taught me the most about program design. So I was at the University of Memphis. I was a part-time fellow at the time, and this was that 6-month period that I showed you on the last slide between January 21 and August 2021. So this taught me the most because I was probably in one of the hardest situations. I had quite a few sports on my plate, so we're just going to click through the sports and the amount of athletes that I had at the time as a fellow. Women's soccer was in season due to COVID, so usually they play in the fall. This year they played in the spring because of the COVID year and the time that we missed. I also had men's soccer that was in season. I had men's tennis that was in season, women's tennis, baseball, rifle, leading to 6 in-season sports with 130 athletes, trying to get them through, trying to train them at a high level, at a high Division I level, taught me the most about program design, because when you have 6 sports, there's no time for fluff, right? There's no time for really kind of like digging in the weeds, I guess, when it comes to programming, adding in some of that extra stuff. You really have to stick to what you know will work, the most effective big rocks, as I guess the best way to put it. So the goals of this presentation, overall, understand where strength and conditioning has been and where it's going, understand the key foundational principles that training programs are built on, help you see things from a big picture perspective, and try to provide the most practical advice, not just straight out of the textbook, which will lead to this next slide. You all are grad students. You have looked at a lot of textbook stuff. You read a lot of research, so I'm going to try to keep this more on the practical side, 75% practical, 25% textbook. Y'all can let me know how I do on that after to see if that's actually a real thing. Okay, so just looking at where strength and conditioning has been and where it's going. So I have actually been in a very unique spot where I have actually been a part of this transition, which is really cool. So there is kind of this old school strength and conditioning way, and there's a new modern strength and conditioning way, mainly because of the help of technology, more funding in this kind of day and age where you are more isolated with your sports. It's not so common at this level to have it where you have 6 or 7 sports as a strength and conditioning coach, where it was pretty common in the past. So just kind of going through the old school stuff, right? Weight room focused, general strength training. In terms of conditioning, it was a lot of just generic stuff, general intervals, general long distance running, right? There were some times when I had more of those higher sport loads that I wouldn't necessarily see the players on the field. I'm in a spot now where I can see I'm on the field all the time. I see the GPS, I see all that awesome stuff, but there were some times I just saw them in the weight room and that was it. I didn't know what was going on at practice or anything like that. So there was no collaboration. Whereas now at this level, you work closely with sports for training alignment. So there's not a day that goes by where I don't talk to our head coach, really on the golf side as well, about what's going on at practice. If players come in sore, I always know what they did at training, where I was kind of in the blind up until that point, or up until this point. Athlete-centered approach, the old school method was one size fits all. Everybody gets the same sheet. Everybody does the same lift. Now you can really start to tailor it to individuals with the amount of testing that we have in front of us, the amount of resources that we have, and then just holistic development. Old school strength and conditioning was more about just strength. I've had recruiting athletes come in on the recruiting process and they're like, how do you train soccer players? How do you train golfers? Do you only lift them all the time? Do you all do any mobility? It's because this old school approach is still out there and it's still around, right? Hopefully minimizing as time goes on, but it is still out there to where it is a kind of, you're only focused on strength and size. But overall, if you want to succeed in strength and conditioning, you have to start to shift more to this modern strength and conditioning mindset, right? It's forward thinking, it's analytical, it's data driven, or it's data informed. Sorry, we'll talk about that. Where you rely not only on some of the big principle stuff, but also know where to look on the technology side. And with some of, really also another one is learning the sport, like learning the language of the sport, learning how the sport's played, the duration of the sport, and things like that, and really working it into your programming. So it really is just another level of strength and conditioning. It's been awesome to see it kind of transition there, not only in certain sports, but really in all sports. Any questions with that? So starting with the basics, this is the big 5 performance of strength and conditioning, right? So talk about old school versus modern. A lot of times it was just strength and conditioning that was focused on in the past, but now it's how can you blend strength, conditioning, speed, plyometrics, and recovery, right? Sounds like a daunting task. That's because it can be, but when you think of everything from a big picture, you have to see each of these pieces as you're planning your programs for your teams, for your athletes. Starting with periodization, y'all have probably seen this in some capacity before, but just generally going over it real quick. Going from the most zoomed out view to the most zoomed in view, the macro cycle is the full calendar year of training. It's all 52 weeks. looking at each kind of mesocycle, those are the 4 to 6 week blocks that make up each training program. So there might be anywhere from 12, 15, 20 of those throughout the year, depending on how you break up your training. And then the microcycle is going to be on a weekly basis. This one is going to change the most frequently. And that is the one that has to be most adaptable. So once again, you can have the coolest macro cycle, you can have the coolest mesocycle, but some of those little smaller, minute changes are going to have to be made on a weekly basis. And then you might actually get to the end of your training year and go back and fix your mesocycles and your macro cycles because you realize it didn't go that way that you originally planned, and that's okay. So we're not going to go into the weeds of this, but this is an example of my college soccer macro cycle. As you can see, all the weeks are labeled at the top. The academic year is underneath that as well. So not only factoring in all of my areas, strength, conditioning, speed, all that stuff, but also where are we at in the semester? Spring semester, fall semester, when are the summer breaks, when are the winter breaks? I always start mine from January all the way going up to November because our off season starts in January and our championship season is in November, December, kind of leading into that transitional period going into winter break around that November, December time. So really you see right here, the strength with the color-coded mesocycles, things like that, where I have a lot of my volumes, exercises that I've used. On a bigger Excel sheet, this has all 5 of those key areas we just talked about. I can't fit it all on this sheet, but once again, it's not about the specifics. It's really just seeing the big picture and how each of these things layer on top of another. Because I know if I look up in my top 2 or 3 mesocycles of strength and they're in nowhere near alignment with the conditioning or the speed, there's going to be a mishap along the way in terms of what happens on the training side. This is a microcycle example. So this is a sample of what a soccer training week looks like. Obviously Sunday starting with, I guess Sunday really ends the week, but in this concept, Sunday being the first day of the week would be a match. Monday would be off or voluntary work for low minute players. Tuesday would be match day -2 is what we call it in soccer terms, but that's going to be really your highest intensity day of the week because you usually play again on Thursday. So if you're going to have that high intensity day, you can't do it on Wednesday before, you can't do it on Monday, the off day. So it always has to be that Tuesday. And then obviously Thursday is going to be the match. Friday is going to be work for some low minute players. And then Saturday will probably be, once again, the match prep leading into the next Sunday match if you have one. But notice, once again, we're not just looking at what lifts am I doing throughout the week here. We're not just looking at what conditioning am I doing throughout the week here. We're looking at what conditioning do I have planned? What do they have planned from a soccer side in terms of total distance, high-speed running, and player load, that HML at the very bottom? And it's how is there, just making sure there's no mismatches along the way. I could have a really high conditioning day planned, and they could have a really low soccer day planned, and that might not be what we want overall from a perspective. But this also, the coaches have this as well. So when I kind of give them recommendations on stuff, they don't just say, like, it doesn't make sense in the moment. They can see Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and it's not just a daily focus. But once again, this is a very clean copy of it. It changes a lot frequently depending on who the opponent is, if there's any injuries, things like that as we go along, and just depending on where the team is at. Most common periodization methods: linear, block, and undulating. Once again, y'all have probably learned this at some capacity, but just a very general definition, right? Linear just builds in intensity over time and drops in volume over time. So you start with really high volume, start to go down to low intensity over time. The benefit of high volume, low intensity in the beginning is great for motor learning in terms of technical ability with the lifts that you're choosing to do, making sure that you don't rush into intensity too much and then athletes are building bad technique on that. Higher volume honestly doesn't have to be through sets of 10, 12, 15. Sometimes it can be a set of 5 with a 5-second eccentric, a 4-second isometric, things like that to really reinforce technical patterns. Because I've learned as a coach, if I always program set to 12, 15, now all of a sudden technique breaks down rep 6 and you get 6 really bad reps after that. So there's some different ways you can do that. Low volume, high intensity, now you're starting to work into general strength, maximum strength, but you can't really build up to that safely unless you hit that high volume and low intensity work first. Now, I will say linear periodization and block periodization kind of get mixed up sometimes because block periodization is more of a specific goal for each training block. So one block in the weight room might be hypertrophy and volume. One block in the weight room might be general strength, max strength. But people can build up linearly through that block cycle, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's linear periodization, because to me, linear periodization is just you're building from low volume or high volume, low intensity to the opposite side over a course of a really long time. Whereas block periodization, you're going to have a different goal for each specific one. So the big thing is you're going to use block periodization in at least the college athletic space a lot more than you'll use linear periodization straight up, because really linear periodization works best probably in some type of return to play protocol, maybe high school athletes who have lower training ages, and you can kind of build it out over a longer period. But working at a high level Division I or any university, honestly, you're going to use a lot of block periodization. Undulating is another one you're going to use in college a lot. That is one that fluctuates a different goal pretty much every day. So some days are going to be power focused. Some days are going to be maybe volume, hypertrophy focused. I use weight room because it's the most common, but you can do that for each of the 5 areas as well. So I'm going to really dive in to the examples of block and undulating, because those are the most 2 common you're going to see. Like I said, linear you won't see as much. So this is what block would look like in each of these areas: strength, conditioning, speed, plyos from a strength side, starting at hypertrophy, that higher volume work, all the way through max strength and power development on the backside. These would each be 3 to 4 week blocks, or 5, depending on how you do your programming as a coach. And that's how that would be over a 3 to 4 month span. Same thing with conditioning. You would start with aerobic capacity, 3 to 4 weeks, go to aerobic power, 3 to 4 weeks, and then finish with the higher intensity anaerobic capacity over 3 to 4 weeks. And that just goes kind of the entire way down from speed, starting with the lowest intensity work, highest volume work, and building it up over time through that. Undulating examples in each of the areas, like we already talked about strength a little bit. I'll say conditioning, some days might be longer aerobic work. Some days might be shorter anaerobic work. If you're in a block, you might do the longer aerobic work every single conditioning day for 3 to 4 weeks. Whereas in the undulating, now you're kind of going one at a time throughout the week, hitting them all throughout the week. Speed, day 1 would be that max velocity, high speed running day where all the sprints are a little bit longer. You might have a shorter change in direction day and a short acceleration day where everything is 5, 10, 15-yard sprints as the emphasis. And we'll kind of talk about splits and training splits as we go along. But for the most part, depending on how many days you have with your team is going to dictate how you really build out that program. Because you might only have 1 day with them, and then you have to do all the speed work in 1 day, and that's okay. Or you might get 4 days with them, and you can really go 1 day of this, 1 day of that, etc. Any questions with that up until this point? Perfect. Okay, needs analysis. This is what you'll need to start with any sport you work with, any athlete you work with. An athlete comes in on their own, says, I play baseball, I play soccer, I play golf. You're going to have to know, if you don't already have a firm understanding of it, you're going to have to know these general things. Anthropometrics, just looking at height, weight, body composition. Biomechanical side of it, key movement patterns within the sport. Energy systems, aerobic versus anaerobic. If you don't know specifically the aerobic versus anaerobic, maybe it's a mix. Maybe you go to the next layer and look at specific work to rest ratios. If you're looking at a tennis athlete, what's the time in between points? What's the time in between sets after they win or lose a set? How much time did they get in between? Things like that. For golf, how long are they waiting in between holes, etc. like that? How far are they walking? All factors to consider. Common injury sites, what are the highest risk areas, and how can we build the program around that? How can we help prevent injuries as much as we can? How much can we help reduce them? Not being reactive and only trying to adjust the program when those injuries come up. Individual factors, nothing really listed there, but that's just really going to be with the help of assessments, movement patterns, things like that, starting to figure out what each athlete individually needs. And that doesn't mean if you have a team of 30, you have 30 individual programs going on, but it might mean you see 3 or 4 key trends within your team, and now you can make 5-10% adjustments throughout the program so that you do meet those individual needs. And then team factors, just looking at injury history, training age, and actual age. You know, injury history, what is the sports injury history, but what is the team's injury history that you're working with? Training age, how much have they trained in the past? You know, have they done a lot of conditioning and speed work, but they've never touched a barbell? Actual age, you know, what is just their actual physiological age compared to their training age? All these things play a really big factor when looking at them. Still continue with the needs analysis. Really, when you start with a team, if you have no background of the sport whatsoever, you have to start by honestly looking up what is the needs analysis for this sport? What are the work rest ratios? What are the key parts of the season for this sport? But as you have your own sport, now all of a sudden you learn the athletes, you learn the team, you learn how their coaches operate and plan. That has to factor into your more specific needs analysis so that you can build the right program. Because if you just go with the generic one all the time, you're going to start to have a lot more blind spots in your training. So, example, a needs analysis for women's college soccer versus Mississippi State soccer. They're very different. Here's one small example, right? If you're looking at research versus practical, on the right is research for women's college soccer. I think it was published last year. But just looking at each position in terms of distance, right? Forwards, center mids, center backs, wing players on the outside. You can see their distance is listed here. You know, for a forward, you're looking at 7,800 yards plus or minus 2,100. A forward on our team from our 2024 calendar year is looking at 7,243 yards a match. Same thing with midfielders. You can look at their almost 11,000 yards of distance, plus or minus 500, and you can see our midfielders usually average 9,700. So once again, it has to become very specific because when we're going into summer and preseason training, I have to think about more on the left side than I do on the right side in terms of that. Well, I guess that might be backwards for you. No, you're right. All good. The context that's usually lost in research is obviously tactical planning, right? We don't know, for example, with all the players that were included in the research, what kind of formation was that team running? Do they run the same formation as we do? Because I can tell you our team has run 2 different formations the past 2 years and the loads are very, very different. So that is a key factor. Subbing patterns and really whose data is included. You don't know if players that are subbing in and out are included. For us, all of our metrics are based off players that played more than 45 minutes, but that's not standardized for the most part in research. So you have to, if it's not included, you're just kind of in the dark on that. And then match duration, do these numbers include things like overtime, extra time? For those that don't know, professional soccer always has extra time that goes on the end of both halves. And it's kind of varies. Sometimes it's 5 minutes, sometimes it's 10 minutes. So all that plays a factor when looking at research for your sport. This is just a sample of a needs analysis comparison, right? We don't have to go through all of them, but just looking at those key things, anthropometrics, biomechanical, energy systems, just really seeing where your team falls into all of these, especially if you have 2 sports, it's good to set up a side-by-side comparison like this. The big thing, I would say, the biggest differences with soccer and golf is just soccer is a contact sport, golf is not. So strength, plyometrics, and speed play a lot bigger of a role on the soccer side just because of that even small piece of context. Whereas golfers, you have to watch how much rotation you're doing in training. Honestly, you don't have to do as much rotation in soccer training because of obviously the key differences. But with soccer or with golf programming, you do have to watch how much rotation you're working in on your end because they're rotating well enough outside at practice. That goes for baseball, softball, golf. A lot of those programs or a lot of those teams always deal with a lot of rotational low back issues. So how do you mitigate, kind of work around that? But like I said, I'm not going to go through all the specifics there, but that's just kind of how you can break one down for your team if you have a new athlete or a new program that you're working with. Designing your sessions. So this is straight out of the textbook. This is part of the 25%, right? Looking at these are the key things that need to be included in your program to make it adaptable, make it progressive, make it effective. So looking at specificity, is training specific to the physiological demands of the sport and athlete? Overload, the program must gradually increase in volume and intensity to maximize adaptation. Progression, all exercises should progress in intensity, difficulty, and specificity over time. Pretty much, there's ways. Everyone thinks that progressing an exercise means changing it completely, and that's not necessarily the case. There are some exercises that remain a constant in our programs year round, whether that be a front squat, a trap bar deadlift, some type of lunge, right? But you can always progress in terms of the tempo they're doing with it, the intent of it. Maybe it's supposed to be really heavy, really slow, you're trying to get a max, or you have velocity-based training hooked up to it and you're doing it for speed and that type of adaptation. So don't think that progression means the exercise just has to change all the time, because it does not. Individualization, once again, just kind of hammering that home. Training should tailor both team, positional, and individual needs. And then the recovery piece. Recovery should be planned into each cycle. So on the micro weekly cycle, that's just going to be the fluctuation between high intensity, low intensity days. Also, whatever that 1 to 2 off days is throughout the week, factoring that in. The mesocycle, every block should have some type of deload week worked into it. Now, I will say I've seen coaches do it different, where it's a specific deload week where everything is super light. You don't move a lot of weight at all. It's almost like a straight recovery week. Really, in the college setting, sometimes you only get 12 weeks. So if you take a 1 week every 4 weeks, you're going to lose 3 weeks of training time on the back end. So what we do sometimes is make week 1 of the next block more of a deload week, so that you can, number one, teach the movements of the new block, but that also becomes a natural deload week without just pulling back the curtain completely. Macro cycle, what are those transition periods, right? Winter or summer breaks. Both of those times are usually really good times for athletes to mentally and physically recover, not neglect training completely, but the focus should be more geared towards recovery in that time. Okay, so looking at strength program design. So as I go through these, the big things we're going to look at are, key movement patterns, key qualities, typical training splits, and then training considerations just for different areas that we see within that training quality. So looking at strength, key movement patterns, I put power development because there's a lot of power development exercises that can work its way into the program, right? For some people, it's Olympic lifting. Sometimes it's med ball throwing. Sometimes it's, Olympic variations. Maybe it's not a full Olympic lift, but we always try to have some type of weighted jump or Olympic variation in the program. A squat pattern, whether that be a front squat, back squat, or even some consider a trap bar deadlift a squat pattern. Some type of a lower body hinge, thing like a RDL, single leg glute bridge, things like that. Upper body push, upper body pull, core and single leg. There will always be some type of single leg training worked in there. Now, whether that's knee dominant or hip dominant can be, alternated throughout the program, but it's important, especially once again, looking at more of a soccer example, it's always important to have some type of single leg training worked in there, given 99% of their time they're on one leg. Key qualities: hypertrophy, general strength, maximal strength, power or rate of force development. Once again, if you're looking at like specific mesocycles or block training, each of your training blocks will probably have one of those key qualities worked in there. You might call it something different. It might be a little bit mix of both, but those 4 or 5 key qualities will be the biggest ones. Typical training splits, this comes from just pure experience. Like, this is what I've seen the most in college athletics. 2-day splits, 3-day splits, and 4-day splits. And these are kind of the weekly breakdowns, but I guess they can vary a little bit. 2-day splits being Monday, Wednesday, and then a Tuesday, Thursday, or a Tuesday, Thursday. If you have a 3-day going Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then 4-day, Monday, Tuesday, off in the middle, and then Thursday, Friday. Off season versus in season, really just know you're programming big rocks. So in the off season, you might be fortunate enough to have a 4-day split, and you can really plan out your training. You can do, 2 or 3 of these things on day 1, 2 or 3 of these things on day 2, 3, 4. But now you have to shrink that all of a sudden down to 2 days because you're going in season, right? This actually kind of just happened for me. I was fortunate during our first month of soccer to have 3 lift days. And now we're playing games again, so we have to bring it down to 2 days. So it's how can I get my big stuff that I want out of those 3 days into 2? So those are the things you have to consider for your programming. This is just the strength session builder, pretty much how I would build out an in-season 2-day split on the left and an off-season 3-day split on the right. So really, in season, you're looking more at that undulating program design or periodization, probably depending on what your situation is. So on day one, it would be more power-based. Day two, it would be more strength-based. What do you all think would flip those two? Like, why do you think I would put power first or strength first? Or what do you think would flip that conversation? Why would you flip it? Anybody?
You want your freshest time. So typically the day one is probably going to be a Monday. And so you want your power, especially if it's high focus of power, especially with how the rep schemes work. You want that on your first day because chances are on day two, they're going to be tired. They're going to have practice. They're going to have classes. So you can get away, you can squeak out having heavier movements, albeit with good form on like your Wednesday, even if they're tired.
Yep.
Whereas if you flipped it and you did some form of an Olympic variation, especially like a clean on the day that they're now probably already tired and we still have the rest of the week to go, that would be ill-advised to say the least.
Fair enough. So yeah, 100% correct, right? If you're looking at a normal training week and you want to get your highest quality work in early, that is a good reason to put the power first. The other one you might not think about is depending on where your match is, right? If you have one competition a week, or if you have two, but mainly if you have a one competition week, you probably want to do the power day closest to that one. It's going to be the lightest, more explosive, kind of have that priming effect that could help performance in that match. So looking at soccer, for example, we usually do any of our Olympic variation work, whether that be a trap bar jump, Olympic clean pulls, things like that, 2 days out from that first Thursday match. And then everything kind of in between that Thursday and Sunday match again is looking to be more just general strength, lower intensity for the players that play a lot on Thursdays. But for golf, for example, they might leave for a tournament on Friday or Saturday. So in their situation, I would probably flip those 2 days to make it strength on the front end and then power on the back end to help them go into that weekend tournament. Make sense? And then the 3-day split is just a total body split of, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. You can pretty much run the same movement patterns each of those days if you have all 3 days. Now, the smaller, intricacies of what that looks like is when you look at what are the 3 different squat patterns you would use. For your upper body push and pull, can one day be more single arm pulling? Can one day be more single arm pushing? Those are the things you factor in when you have more days to train with. Looking at conditioning program design. So if you look at conditioning as a pyramid, aerobic capacity is going to be at the bottom. That is our base, right? If you don't have a strong base to work off of, you really can't maximize everything at the top of it. The aerobic power, the anaerobic capacity, the anaerobic power. So think of aerobic power as really that high intensity aerobic work, kind of right before you go into the anaerobic zone. Anaerobic capacity is those really hard, high intensity, shorter rest interval type of workouts, where anaerobic power is a lot of your really heavy strength work, speed work, where you get longer recovery on the back end, things like that. So those are the key qualities, right? Those 4 key qualities, typical training splits. If you have 2 days, one day might be aerobic, one might be anaerobic. If you have 3, you can do an aerobic, anaerobic, and then a hybrid day on the back end. And then 4-day, you can do 2 and 2. Training considerations, practice demands, right? Just looking at what is the practice going to be that day. So if you're looking at conditioning just being that sole thing, you might be able to spend 15 or 20 to 35 minutes on it completely, and then that be the high intensity training day. If there's conditioning or if there's practice involved, you might have to bring that down, change the intervals around a little bit to make that 10 to 15 minutes so that you're not taking away too much time from the coaches and staff. High versus low impact. Notice that pretty much any conditioning you do or think about in a team setting is high impact just because of how much high impact running is, right? But think about, you can also get lower intensity or even high intensity work done on low impact stuff like bikes, assault bike or bikes versus even swimming sometimes. So those are ways to work in conditioning if you're like in an in-season period and you have players that might just need a little bit extra, but you might still need them for a match coming up. So they can work in some low intensity work or high intensity work on something low impact. Strength, if you're working strength and conditioning on the same exact day, I have historically had the best, I guess, most success with keeping lower body on anaerobic work days. Think of it, higher intensity anaerobic work, it's usually shorter, so the legs kind of refresh a little bit going into the lower body session. The aerobic work, the longer work, those workouts can be grueling, right? Long intervals or steady state training. It usually feels better to go in and hit an upper body day right after those if you have the freedom to kind of space them out that way. So this is what a conditioning session could look like in season on the left, off season on the right. In season, anaerobic capacity work, the high intensity work early in the week, kind of like Sam was talking about. Now, I will say if conditioning is that main focus early in the week, 2 or 3 days away from a match, we'd probably do it first because they are going to be the most fresh in that capacity rather than doing it at the end of practice where they're already going to be worn down, higher risk of injury, things like that. Day 2, right, if you're looking to do any active recovery work, things like that, now we probably put it on the back end because the intensity is going to be lower anyway. It can almost serve as like a flushing of the legs, if you want to call it that. And then off season, looking at a 3-day split, one day is a short interval session, one's a long interval, and then that third day is kind of a hybrid where you can get kind of creative with a mix of long and short intervals. Conditioning demands, right? Looking at practice demands like we talked about, managing high versus low minute loads, and then conditioning through small-sided games. That is a big one that we do in soccer in terms of trying to set really specific dimensions of the field, the amount of players involved in it. Maybe it's a 4v4 or 5v5 if we're looking for something really high intensity or anaerobic. Now, the problem with that, or that we can see arise from that, is you have to make sure all the players are working equally. So we saw it a little bit last fall where certain position groups weren't having to work as hard in the game. So on the surface, it looks like, yeah, everybody's getting a lot of fitness. But when you kind of peel back the layers, you see that there are certain players not getting that fitness stimulus that you want. Also, higher fitness or players with higher fitness levels doing small-sided games might not hit the high enough intensity to get a true fitness adaptation out of it. Whereas an unfit player is probably going to go into those really high heart rate zones because they're working harder, but a fit player is maybe only going to work at 70 to 80%, and maybe that's not what you wanted. So these are all things you have to focus on when building out your conditioning in season. Speed program designs, the key qualities: acceleration, deceleration, change of direction, agility, max velocity. Like I said, looking at the training splits, 2 days or 3 days. If you have 2 days, you're probably going to have to blend the XL, decel, and change of direction all into one, leaving max velocity on its own just because XL, decel, and change of direction are all relatively shorter. It's pretty simple to work that all into one session. Whereas if you're trying to combine max velocity and change of direction, you're training on 2 wider spectrums, if that makes sense. 3 days, acceleration. I'll usually break down acceleration into its own piece at that point. Just everything shorter distance sprinting, decel and COD. Now I'll kind of make everything more working on the brakes, maybe add in some partner reactive work to make it more agility based, and then just keeping everything still relatively short, but it's a different type of demand. And then max velocity stays on its own. Training considerations, as it is for everything, is just looking at off season versus in season. I'll say the biggest difference is in off season, you can really plan out your speed progressions in terms of setting your blocks and progressing from week 1 all the way to week 4. With in season, you really have to do what we call microdosing in terms of you can work it into your warm-ups. So it might be the last 5 minutes of a warm-up where you're doing 3 to 4 really good sprints or jumps or things of that nature, but that becomes your speed work because of the time is so limited. And then alignment with the plyometrics. We try our best to keep everything aligned between plyos and speed in the direction at which we're working. So acceleration, if you think about it, is shorter, but you're working more at a horizontal position, right? Think of like broad jumps, skips for distance, things like that. Whereas everything at max velocity sprinting is more vertical. So working vertical jumps, everything from an upright position in terms of plyometrics. But we try to blend those two together so it not only gets us what we want physiologically wise, but also we can kind of teach mechanics with it as well. Plyometric program design. looking at, these are the key things we're trying to look at: vertical, horizontal, like we talked about, multi-directional, double leg or single leg, just always making sure there's some type of balance between double leg and single leg. Is even if it's a sport like golf where they don't jump a lot, you do need to incorporate single leg work because there are parts of the swing that it is generated more from a single leg position. Plyometrics that never leave my program personally are skips, bounds, hops, and bilateral jumps. Just because they're so versatile in how you train them and how you coach them, you can have them be more geared towards acceleration emphasis on the speed side. You can have them max effort, max intent. They can go more max velocity work. Like those types of hops and bounds, they support the speed work that you're doing at all times. So that's why they'll never, well, I say that. As of now, they will never leave my program. Looking at a training split, right? 2 days. If you only have 2, you're probably going to work in more of the horizontal, multi-directional. Almost think of it the exact same way as the speed work, blending that with the acceleration and the multi-directional change of direction work. And then vertical being on the max velocity day. 3 days, you might do the horizontal plyos with the acceleration speed day, multi-directional plyos with the change of direction speed day, and then vertical with the max velocity day. I know I'm throwing a lot of terms at you, a lot of directions, a lot of angles. Are there any questions with that? The big things to consider are safe progressions, right? Building volume very slowly on those, starting where it's very technical based, teaching based, so that you can really learn the positions, how you should take off, how you should land before you just go into full blown repetitive high intensity plyometrics. And then creativity, you can get really creative with plyos. Obviously you want to have a theme for what you're trying to do. You want to have a basis for what you're trying to do, but there are a lot of different ways that you can train plyos, whether it's with hurdles, just different degrees of movement, things like that. So we can always kind of keep that in mind as we do them. Bonus slide, 8 vectors. So 8 vectors is a book that really focuses on change of directions, aligning speed with plyos, things like that. But pretty much as you can see, the 4 different areas, they're not 4 different, they're multiple different arrows, multiple different angles. Those are pretty much all the angles that you're exposed to in sport. So the idea is that your plyometrics and your speed should always incorporate many, many angles and directions so that you can build up and be ready for that, because it's not realistic to think that sport is just straight left and right. You have to work in all those different angles as well. So very good book. I don't know if there's actually a hard copy, but there is a digital copy if you are interested in looking at that. But that was just a bonus slide that might help you all. Speed and plyometric session builder. I started messing with this a while back, and I realized probably the most simplest speed framework to get both plyos and speed in a very short amount of time is to do what you see on the left. Warm up, some type of mechanic drill, double leg plyometric, a single leg plyometric, 1 speed drill, and then another speed drill. So once again, if you're in the very introductory stages of your program, that might be your double leg plyo might be drop off a 6-inch box and stick the landing. If you're in late preseason and you're in like peak mode, maybe that's repeat vertical jumps at the highest of intensities, right? But this is just kind of a framework that I've used, and really depending on how many days you have and how much time you have, you can build that out however. So maybe it becomes one day is 2 single leg plyometrics, 2 speed drills, and the next day is 2 double legs and 2 speed drills, just making variations within that, but the framework stays the same. And you can also add on to these exercises as you go along as well if you have more time. Just looking at in season, highest intensity speed work or plyos, probably furthest from match day if you're going for really high intensity. If you're looking to do more of like a priming effect, you might be able to get away with some lower to moderate intensity jumps like the day before the game if it's working into some speed component. So with soccer, sometimes the day before a match, we'll do some agility work, some supporting plyometrics for that, but it's really just to kind of get the nervous system going and get things fired up before the match the next day. But it's not a lot of high volume, high intensity work. It's really quick, kind of get in and get out type deal. And then off season 3-day split, just really focusing on the mechanics, progressively loading it, not jumping out too fast and overloading the athlete early on, and focusing more on force development rather than the reactivity or the high intensity work. Periodize your training year. So now we're going to go through each of the training phases and just kind of focus on what each of these areas, each of these training areas look like throughout each of those big times of the year. How am I doing on time?
Yeah.
Half hour, perfect. All right. So starting with the force velocity curve, because we're going to talk about as we move through periodization, high force or high velocity. If you haven't seen this before, pretty much the force is on the left, velocity is on the right, meaning the highest velocity thing you can do is a max speed sprint or plyometrics. That's what you see to the far right of the curve at the bottom. And the highest force activity you can complete is max strength. Think of like a 1 RM, really heavy, gruel it out set of back squats, right? Because there's not a lot of velocity, there's a lot of force, whereas sprinting, there is a lot of force, but it's a lot more velocity on the back end. So we're going to talk about this a lot as we move through, but the big thing is just understanding that as a coach, you can put any exercise that you can imagine anywhere on this curve. So there are some times where I have back squats that are at the very high end of the force, like you see here, where it's 80, 90, 100% of 1 RM. There's also times where it falls somewhere in between speed strength and maximum speed because there's not a lot of weight in the bar and we are moving it as fast as possible. That goes with any type of plyo. You can load it up however you want to with weight or things like that. Just know, don't think that back squats can only be high force or sprints can only be high velocity. You can also do loaded sprints, things like that to move it up the force side of the curve, if that makes sense. So looking at early off season, right, just going down each of these areas. Overall, you can see the trend of with strength and conditioning, it's going to be higher volume, lower intensity, and speed is going to be lower volume, higher intensity. And when I say higher intensity, I don't necessarily mean like all out max effort when it comes to speed and plyos, but it's going to be high effort, but the volume is going to be lower, if that makes sense. And then strength and conditioning, like we talked about, volume is going to be higher, more of that high rep, low intensity work. Notice with all of these, the big thing is optimal technique. Like early off season is your time as a coach to set the foundation for how your team will move the next 52 weeks. So as you go through, everything is super technical. We don't honestly in my early off season block, we don't get through a lot of complex movements by any means, because we're really slowing it down, doing jump and stick on every single plyometric, making sure we feel it in the right spots, making sure it looks right, feels right the entire time. And that goes really all the way down from a strength side, conditioning side, speed, and plyometric side. But realize if you rush that process, now you're going to be in the late off season and wishing you would have spent more time on the technique in the early off season. So keeping that in mind, that's a big part of early off season. Just looking at some of the specific methods and notes, a lot of eccentric isometric loading, like we talked about earlier, just getting really creative with how you do specific strength exercises, doing your foundational movements. So what are the key movements you're going to do throughout the training year and how can you start building them now? Looking at some of the speed work, starting short and working to long. So we'll start with really 5 to 10 yard sprints and then build that out to longer distances over time. Now, if you're working in a sport where you need to train a little bit of max velocity throughout the year, you can't wait until the 3rd month of training to do a long sprint. You can start to work in some of those flying or longer sprints at sub-maximal intensity. So maybe you're doing like a flying 10 where you build up 20 yards, sprint fast for 10 yards at 70 to 80%. And then by weeks 2 and weeks 3, now you're hitting 90 or 100% or things like that. So don't think short to long means totally neglect long sprinting, but you just got to be really intentional and creative with how you do that. Late off season, right now everything jumps up in intensity. Volume goes low on conditioning and strength, and high intensity goes up on those. Speed work, volume comes up, intensity stays high. Once again, now that's actually a mix of higher intensity work and just high intent overall. Really, all your speed work is always going to be really high intent. It's just how you manipulate the volume is going to be kind of the adaptation you get out of it. So that's on the strength side. That's where you're going to go up to general or max strength. On conditioning side, you're going to look at the high intensity aerobic work, the really like we talked about, kind of grueling anaerobic capacity work, middle top of the pyramid. And then as you'll see with the speed and the plyometrics, I have highlighted in there and like improved force production. That's because late in the off season on that force velocity curve, I'm hitting more of the force side because I know I still have a couple of weeks or months left before preseason comes. I want to maximize how much force we can produce so that when we go to produce velocity come preseason, come in season, we've built up the foundation enough. If we're just hitting the velocity side all the time, we don't work on our force development, we won't be able to maximize it. We might be able to get by, but if you want to maximize it, you have to build up force capacity first and then hit the velocity side later on. So really, you do that with speed or things like resisted sprinting, just adding the complexity or maybe even bringing down the amount of cutting you do, but making it harder, more intense. And then max effort flying sprints on the high speed running side. Strength weight room, going up to some type of max effort. You know, for me, working with soccer and golf, I have never really done a 1 rep max. I think I always stick around at 2 or 3 rep max because it's a little bit safer. You don't go as heavy, and then I'll use equations on the back end to get that estimated 1 rep max to send them home with if it goes into like a summer break or something like that. And also a lot of velocity-based training tools will now even predict that for you, which is kind of nice. So we use something called Vitruve. You can do a set of 10 at 135 pounds, and it will take your speed every single rep to determine what your 1 rep max would probably be. So that makes it a lot easier to do that. And then plyometrics, weighted plyometrics. So think about this might be when you're doing your heaviest Olympic variations, trap bar jumps, dumbbell jumps, whatever that looks like, but not so much focused on the velocity side, but the force side. Any questions with that? Preseason, now the volume's still up there, but the intensity is getting higher and higher, and the volume will start to come down now. So as we go into preseason, whether it's when the team is actually back in full training mode with the coaches, or if you get them a little bit before, you're going to drop that percentage down on their strength side and start to shift your curve now to the velocity-based side like we talked about. Everything will become faster, more explosive. On the conditioning side, looking at more repeat sprintability, especially in soccer, because if you do a lot of high-intensity anaerobic capacity work in the late off-season, yeah, you're working at pretty high intensities with shorter or sometimes longer rest, but soccer requires max effort sprints, and you might have to do 2 or 3 of them for 5, depending on the game, worst case scenario. So it really becomes about that sprint becomes max effort, short to moderate rest, go again. But that's what you kind of work up to over the course leading into preseason. Looking at speed, it becomes more position specific, or not position specific, sport specific. So whereas we might have just been doing straightaway linear long sprints early or late in the off season, now we're getting into, you know, soccer where 70 to 80% of the sprints you make have a curved piece to them. So now we're going to work more of that because it's more position and sport specific. Plyometrics, same thing. Now we're looking more at the velocity side. They're more reactive, more explosive. It's not jump and stick anymore. It's not really heavy trap bar or dumbbell jumps anymore. It's lighten it up a little bit, but everything is max intent, really rapid fire, explosive. And then single leg emphasis, once again, for a sport like soccer, will start to take precedent just because you have to prepare them for that to come in the matches. In season, as you can see, volume on our end, strength and conditioning's in, stays really low. Sport volume is going to be very high. I don't have that included, but that kind of speaks for itself. And then, but the intensity can stay high, right? If you have low volume and low intensity, you're probably going to detrain. So from a conditioning side, we might just do something as simple as 1 set of 10 repeat sprints at a sub-maximal intensity or something like that. But we touch it and then we move on into practice. But we kind of keep the stimulus there. Hopefully you built a big enough foundation at that point to where you won't really detrain. Now, if you didn't build up your foundation in the off season, you might run into problems. But if you really took the steps to build it over the course of those 4 phases before this, you don't have to worry too much about losing it all over the course of the in-season period. Speed work, like we talked about, becomes more microdosing, just working it in 5 to 10-minute bouts, depending on how much time you have in practice. Plyometrics, same thing. You work that usually into that speed work microdose. So that also becomes microdosed. And then strength for us becomes a lot of velocity-based training. It starts slower. For those that are familiar with velocity-based training, we start around 0.6 on the VBT scale, which allows us to still move weight, but it's not overly taxing, overly fatiguing. And then by the time we get to October, November, SECs, NCAAs, we're up near 1.0, and that bar is moving on the ones we move it with. And that's the same with golf. So when we're in season, we'll start around that 0.6, and then as we get up to, April when SEC comes around, we want to be up near 1.0 and everything like that. Because honestly, when you're trying to peak a team, you don't necessarily, you can't really peak for NCAAs, because if you don't make SECs, you're probably going to be fighting for your life to get into NCAAs. So you have to try to fight for that one first and then work off the back end. Integrating technology. First of all, any questions with that last piece? No? Okay. Technology I had at previous jobs, just for fun. Pen, paper, stopwatch, a jump mat, and timing gates. I got timing gates my last year at Memphis. It was a thrill. Looking at my technology at Mississippi State, now we have NordBoard, adductor or force frame, jump mat or jump plates. We have GPS, DEXA scanners, VBT, our smart speed speed gates, StatSport heart rate monitors, and wellness questionnaires. So it was a massive whirlwind, a big flip. But what this taught me was key training principles, right? When you don't have a lot of technology, you have to base a lot off coaching eye, coaching intuition. You see more how consistency works over complexity, right? It's really easy to get in the weeds with the technology side of things. And really, honestly, sometimes you're looking into things that don't necessarily matter. But it's really hard to do when you have none of it to do that with. Creative programming, right? You don't get to, or you have to get really creative to break monotony. Whereas, with VBT, I can change up the speed from one block to another, and that adds kind of that change for the athlete, for the team. Well, if you don't have that, you have to find ways to change the exercises, change the focus, etc. Simple ways to assess performance and readiness. For example, I have the force plates here that give me all the details I could ever imagine. The peak height, the power output, the asymmetries, whereas I had a jump mat at Memphis. So we had to do things like taking their max height compared to their body weight. We had to do the equations on our own, and then we would use a percentage of that to see what our athlete readiness was, whereas it's really easy to do that on the force frames now. So it forces you to get creative with that. So having minimal technology allowed me to build a training system based on current research principles and experience. And then at MSU, I've been able just to take that same exact system that I built out to test its effectiveness. So that's really the thing with technology, is using it to test a training system, not necessarily create a training system. Data informed versus data driven. The problem with current strength and conditioning is that upcoming coaches are trying to learn the technology before creating their system. So I run into a lot of interns that will necessarily start here or start at bigger programs, and that's what a lot of the curriculum is geared towards. It's how they use the data, what they're looking at, and then you don't really see the entire training side of it, right? So that leads to a data-driven approach where everything is let the data decide, decisions made solely on data rather than intuition, prioritizes only measurable outcomes. So think about if you're with a team that uses GPS, the coaches are, if you go over 3,030 yards, practice is done, practice is over, that sort of thing. It's all based on the metrics. Whereas you want to be data informed, where you use data to guide, not dictate. Use it as feedback. Did we actually achieve what we wanted to do? So a lot of times we'll go into a practice or something like that with a goal in mind. And then, we might go over distance a little bit. We might undershoot it a little bit. But did we actually hit based on the numbers what we expected to hit? And then do we need to make adjustments based off that? Not so much using it to drive our decisions. It's more flexible, adaptable, and it encourages the need for context. Once again, it's not just research-based. It does rely on that intuition and feel, and you start to look at the big picture a little bit more in that regard. Yep.
Is it the same approach with an injured athlete? With intuition, or do you, with an injured athlete, maybe go off the data maybe a little bit differently?
Yeah. I think you definitely rely on the data more if you do have an injured athlete, if you have it available to you. Now, I will say in those early stages of rehab and things like that, how much can you really use some of that stuff if they're not in a position where they can't use it? But 100%. And I also think it depends on how much data you have for that athlete already in terms of what is their baseline. If they're a third year, or if they're like a third year player and you have tons of data already, I think you use it. If it's like a first year freshman, you might be running more on intuition, feel, just progressing it like you would basic principles that we talked about earlier on in the presentation, where it's just linear, building it up, things like that. Good question though. Anybody else?
Could you argue as well with like an injury and things like that, especially because like we'll use ACL tears as the example because those have different severities, right? Do you think sometimes because with how the healing works, because for some people they can do 9 months, but it's really more recommended of like the 12 before they go back, even going based off of data that could lead you to releasing them early when you shouldn't have.
For sure. For sure. Because once again, a lot of that argument, once again, I haven't dove into the specific research on it, but a lot of it is the tissue healing, right? And how much data can you get on tissue healing, right? You might say, oh, after 9 months, she's at 90% of her max speed. She can squat 85% of what she was doing.
Yeah.
But can you see how much the tissue's healed? And is it going to be as resilient as it was if you wait that extra 3 months? So I definitely see that. Yeah. Summary, in short term, use research to help you get started or innovate your use of technology. Long term, use it as feedback to track your own training ideas and adjust based on the feedback it gives you. That's why I love being here in Mississippi State, is that we do have pretty much every resource you can imagine. If you go to some other schools, you won't have as many resources as you do here. Obviously, having connections with the athlete engineering and department as well helps as well. So just being able to try anything and see if it works. And then if it doesn't work, you throw it out. If it works, you stick and it's in your program forever. So that's the way I look at technology. And I think it's because of where I came from in terms of not having any. So you kind of learn that perspective. But I think if you learn that perspective and now try to work off that, you'll be a lot more better off in the long term, no matter if you're training at a Division III, a youth athlete, or all the way up to an elite level Olympic athlete. Questions? That's all I got.
I got a question.
Yeah.
What's your approach on like when you get a new athlete from who's like in their last year for a transfer for the NIL? Is it different? Do you take a different approach on programming with incoming like transfers? Not so much as like a high school coming in, college, but
I always start at ground zero regardless. So, because at the end of the day, I don't know how they've been coached. I don't know because sometimes they say, yep, I was 5 years at this really big university, but they don't move the way you want them to move. They don't sprint the way you want them to sprint or whatever. So I always tell people I'm going to have you at ground zero. Whether you're at ground zero for 15 minutes or 2 weeks is just going to depend on where you're at physically.
What about different variations on like hand grips for exercises? Like, do you have to like factor in different exercises due to like your athletes? Let's say like baseball, they tend to have like a lot of UCL tears. Like, do you usually like work around like immobilities? Do you work more on mobility based?
Honestly, I focus more on the mobility side. I honestly haven't emphasized the way they grip on certain exercises all that much in the past. Now, if it's, I like to go like underhand grip and things like that because it takes more off the shoulder, especially on pulling exercises. But when I've had baseball players or softball players in the past, it's really been more of a feel thing. If they have issues doing a certain grip that we're working on, then we would adjust and modify it. But I've never looked at it as you need to do this for elbow strength. Now we will work in the past with those sports, I've worked in specific grip strength I even do that with golf as well, but targeting grip in that way, and then having a little bit more flexibility in terms of what it looks like on specific, more common exercises.
Question.
Yep.
So, like you said, and I'm kind of similar way where I had technology. We had a bird tech.
Oh, there you go.
Something. But do you think if a, say, graduate student, they get a job, internship, whatever, and they're in more of a data-driven environment for the first experience, do you think that might handicap them a little bit on their ability to function as an independent strength coach apart from using data versus how we all do more data?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I was kind of saying is I feel like if you're in a very data-driven place, I think the goal is to try to understand the training principles they're using more than just what they're looking at technology-wise. Because that's why I said I feel like a lot of places are now teaching the technology first before the training principles are really there, and then you become chasing numbers rather than training outcomes.
One thing I tell them, I tell a lot of people is, whether you're a personal trainer, strength coach, do just a warehouse with some squat racks, bars, bumper plates, dumbbells, kettlebells, platforms, zero technology. You good?
Yeah.
I hope it can be good, should be.
Yeah. So that's funny you say that because I was listening, there was an entrepreneur one time who said, in the world we live in, the internet, like being an entrepreneur in business is so easy now compared to when this guy was coming up like 30 years ago, whatever. And he said, if the internet left today, I would still be able to do it more than everybody else because everybody else came up in the technology era. And I thought about that from the strength and conditioning side, is if all technology left tomorrow, if Mississippi State threw out their funding for technology research and athlete engineering tomorrow, once again, hopefully it never happens. But if it happened, if it all vanished tomorrow, would I be able to run confidently a program that was effective? Now, once again, you might have more blind spots naturally than you do right now, but based on the principles and stuff, could you run the same program? I think that's almost a good frame of what you're saying is, could you do it with just pen and paper and the equipment that you need?
I know one thing, I read an article, it was more on just like learning capabilities, but it was a group that was given ChatGPT, they could use to answer questions, another group did not. And the group that had AI performed better than the group that did not, but then when they took AI away from that group, they performed far worse.
Shocker.
Because they weren't learning the information, they were relying on something else
Yeah.
for it versus using that as an aid. One more question I had, what sport that you work with, because you work with a lot, was the most challenging program for?
I honestly think it is soccer. To be completely honest, it is soccer. But that makes it kind of fun for me because once again, if you look at like modern strength and conditioning, I don't think there's any other sport, really any field sport, I think is the same way. It's not just soccer. In terms of how highly integrated you have to be as a strength and conditioning coach, in terms of you help oversee the distances, the high speed running, the load they're doing in the weight room, what they're doing off the weight room. Like everything has to be aligned and you have to see a big picture or you will miss things. And I think that's what makes it the most challenging compared to some sports where you don't see practice as much or it's not as much of a load demanding sport. Some of those blind spots aren't as important, but with a sport like soccer or any field sport, whether that's rugby, lacrosse, field hockey, it's all kind of the same thing, is like each piece of performance is crucial.
Oh, I got a question. So when you're doing like max performance testing, like Bronco, beep, stuff like that, when you're like setting like a standard or like how like we do it, we like 40 on the beat, or no, 60 on the beat, and 5, 10 on the Bronco. Like, where do you find like that gauge between like professional level versus college and like position based? Like, do you separate it versus position, or do you more of just try like kind of like just a broad standard?
So I think I think
where is
you-
too much and like where it like starts to hinder like your power base and stuff. Like you get the conditioning, but then like you lack power, or like not power, but like it compromises you in the weight room because like obviously if you run a ton, then you can't like excel like fully in both of them and continue to like strive. Like there is like a cap.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is, I think it's team dependent. I think kind of like I have in here, like you have to rely on research at first. So like so probably when I started with soccer, it was like, okay, what are some typical training splits you see in college or professional soccer? Like how do they build those out? And then kind of working off of those. I think from a max exertion testing, things like that, I think a broad standard is kind of what fitness level will let you compete at this level of soccer or whatever sport it is. Now, I think the positional ones can be more position based, obviously, but based on your demands. So if you're looking at soccer, for example, midfielders better be near that stand. Like everybody should be at the standard, but like midfielders are going to really need it the most. Defenders probably right there in the middle between forwards and midfielders, and then forwards usually no fault of their own, I guess, just don't have the same exact fitness level as like a midfielder does because the sport doesn't require it as much. Now they have more speed, but back to the question, like I think those are some of the kind of smaller decisions that has to be made that kind of based on what are the positional demands and what is that difference look like?
Because I know we get new teams, but then like we keep like the same standard and then like for like how like we've been doing, like we've been chasing like a higher and higher one. But like where is that like where like high like that is the number, it does need to be higher due to like performance. Cause like I know a lot of like our girls that have gone pro, like their teams, their fitness standards like a lot lower than ours.
Yeah.
Or not like a lot, but like enough to like make a difference to like our team would pass flying colors.
Yeah. But I mean, I think
Is that like more like a coaching preference or is that more like your preference?
I think it's more of, I don't know if I'd ever say there's a level where it's too much, but I think I think it depends how fast you move the standard is based on where the team's at. So it's like, if you have 30% hit the 60 standard, you probably shouldn't move it to 65. Now, if you have 90% hit the 60 mark, now maybe it becomes 61, 62, just so you have that, you can keep moving it up. Now, I don't think, once again, I don't think there's a level like in terms of that where it's like, if you go to 63 as the standard, now you're not going to be strong and powerful because you're kind of asking about the contrast.
Okay.
But I think I think it's about kind of setting the goal based on where your team's at. And then once again, if it's 30% get 60, maybe you move it back a little bit. Like, I think it kind of just depends.
I know that would make it drop off between like the higher and the lower, create like a more of a like spread. Because like we have some girls that like we have to run extra because their level's so high. But then you have some girls that like literally could never, but they would take a longer time to get there than the ones from the like the top to the bottom, I guess. It's like how do you narrow that gap with fitness test involved? Like you're making your own fitness.
Yeah. So are you referring to like when we do team conditioning sessions and like the girls have further distances? So very quickly, like that's built off of what they call maximal aerobic speed training. So pretty much we run a fitness test and we set our conditioning goals for sessions based on players' maximal aerobic speed. So every day we target an energy system with that. It might be anaerobic capacity, right? If we're doing like a 30 on, 30 off. But if somebody with that really high, like someone with a level 63 beep runs at the same distance as somebody with a 54 beep, they might be in a different energy system than where that other person is. Whereas if the 54 runs at the level of 50 or 65, they're going to be way at the top, more anaerobic, and we want to be anaerobic capacity. They might be at the way further end. And now, so that's where that comes from. And I think, like with your original question, I think you narrow that gap by being really intentional with how you program the conditioning throughout the year. Because as you've seen, especially with our team, is like a lot of those girls that were like 5:30, 5:45 on the Bronco, sticking to that conditioning over really long periods of time. They weren't running at the same distance as the highest fitness players, but now they have bridged the gap and they've gone from 5:45 to 5:15, 5:20. And now, once again, they're not here, but they have bridged the gap by working at those, I guess, consistency. Yeah. Cool.
Well, I appreciate you coming out here.
Yeah, of course.
Yay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Y'all got exam on Thursday. Good luck, have fun. It'll be all right. Got a lot of grade left, so I appreciate you coming out.
See y'all later.
You know, get to practice.
Sure.
Do you have those,
Yes.
PowerPoints?
I'll say I was going over them